I was 23 years old when I realized my parents had been preparing me for failure my entire life. Not intentionally, not cruelly, but with every be realistic, every don't get your hopes up, every people like us don't do that. They were building a ceiling over my head and calling it protection. The night I figured this out, I was sitting in a university bathroom stall at 11 p.m., mascara running down my face, holding a rejection letter I'd hidden from everyone. My mother's voice was ringing in my ears. "See? I told you. You're just not cut out for this." But she was wrong, and the person who proved it? A 67-year-old professor with coffee-stained cardigans and a habit of seeing people for who they could become, not who they'd been told to be. This is the story of how I learned the difference between being enough for others and being enough for myself. If you've ever felt like you're fighting for approval from people who will never give it, keep watching. And if this story resonates, let me know in the comments. I read every single one. Let me take you back. I grew up in a house where love was a performance review. My parents weren't monsters. They were immigrants who'd sacrificed everything to give me opportunities they never had. My father worked double shifts at a manufacturing plant. My mother cleaned houses during the day and took accounting courses at night. They wanted me to be successful, stable, safe. And to them, that meant one thing: a practical career with a guaranteed paycheck. Doctor, lawyer, engineer, accountant. Those were the approved options. Or anything else was a hobby or a phase, or my personal favorite, something you do after you get a real job. I was 7 the first time I told my mother I wanted to be a writer. We were in the kitchen. She was chopping vegetables for dinner, and I was sitting at the table with a notebook covered in crayon stories about talking animals and magic trees. "Mama, when I grow up, I want to write books." She didn't even look up from the cutting board. "That's nice, sweetheart. But what do you want to do for work?" I didn't understand the question. Writing was work. Real work. Important work. "I want to write stories that make people feel things," I said, using the most articulate 7-year-old phrasing I could muster. She finally stopped chopping, turned to look at me with this expression. Not cruel, not mocking. Just tired. "Baby, and people who write stories are born into money or get very, very lucky. We are neither. You need something solid, something that pays." And just like that, my dream got filed under unrealistic. That conversation set the tone for the next 15 years. Every passion I developed got the same treatment. When I joined the school newspaper, my father asked why I wasn't in mathletes instead. When I won a regional poetry competition, my mother reminded me that awards don't pay the bills. When I got accepted into a summer creative writing workshop, they made me go to a pre-law camp instead. I learned to split myself in two. There was the version of me that existed at home, the obedient daughter, the straight A student, the one who nodded along when my parents planned my future over dinner. And then there was the version that existed in stolen moments, the girl who filled notebooks with stories she'd never show anyone, who stayed up late reading novels by flashlight, who daydreamed entire worlds during boring lectures. By high school, I'd perfected the art of invisible rebellion. I joined the literary magazine, but told my parents it was a resume builder for college applications. I took creative writing as an elective, but told them it was English composition, which, technically, wasn't a lie. I applied to universities with strong liberal arts programs, but made sure they also had reputable pre-med or pre-law tracks I could mention at home. The lying exhausted me. But the alternative, full-on confrontation, seemed worse. Because here's the thing about immigrant parents. Their disappointment isn't just disappointment. It's betrayal. It's, "We gave up everything for you to throw it away." It's, "You don't understand what we sacrificed." And honestly, they were right. I didn't understand. How could I? I hadn't lived their story, hadn't experienced their struggles. So I convinced myself that maybe they were right about everything else too. Maybe I wasn't talented enough to make it as a writer. Maybe I was being naive and impractical. Maybe the smart thing, the mature thing, was to choose security over passion. I buried my dreams so deep, I almost convinced myself they'd never existed. Almost. I started university as a biology major, not because I loved biology, not because I'd spent my childhood fascinated by cells and ecosystems, but because it kept my parents happy and kept my options open for medical school. Doctor was the golden ticket in my family, the ultimate proof that their sacrifices hadn't been wasted. So I signed up for Intro to Biology, General Chemistry, Statistics, all the pre-med requirements. And I was miserable, not in an obvious way. I showed up to class, took notes, studied, got decent grades. But there was this hollowness to it all, like I was watching someone else live my life. In those first few weeks, I'd walk past the arts building and feel this physical ache in my chest. I'd see flyers for the creative writing club and have to force myself to keep walking, because I'd made a deal with myself. 4 years of practical education. Then I'd get a stable job, and maybe, if I had time, I could write on the side. That was the plan, the reasonable, mature, parent-approved plan. It lasted exactly 6 weeks. There was this general education requirement. All students had to take at least one arts or humanities elective. Most pre-med students chose something easy. Art appreciation, music history, film studies where you just watched movies and wrote a couple of papers. I was scrolling through the course catalog in my dorm room, looking for the path of least resistance, when I saw it. Narrative structure. The art of storytelling. The description read, an exploration of how stories work across mediums, literature, film, oral tradition. Students will analyze narrative techniques and create original work. No previous experience required. My cursor hovered over it. This was stupid. I should choose something easier. Something that wouldn't take time away from my science courses. But my finger clicked add to schedule before my brain could stop it. I told myself it was just to fulfill the requirement, that it didn't mean anything. I told myself I'd drop it if it interfered with my real classes. I told myself a lot of things that turned out to be lies. The course was taught by Professor Elizabeth Hartley. I didn't know it then, but that woman was about to dismantle every limiting belief I'd built around myself. I'll never forget the first day of that class. I showed up 10 minutes early and sat in the back row, my standard move. Be invisible. Be forgettable. The room gradually filled with an eclectic mix of students, theater majors with purple hair, English majors with vintage blazers, a few confused-looking business students who'd probably chosen this class for the same reason I had. At exactly 2 p.m., Professor Hartley walked in. She was not what I expected. 67 years old, with steel gray hair pulled into a messy bun, reading glasses on a beaded chain, a cardigan that had definitely seen better days, covered in what I later learned were coffee stains from various departmental meetings. She moved like someone who'd stopped caring what people thought decades ago. She set her battered leather bag on the desk, pulled out a stack of papers, and then looked up at all of us with this expression I couldn't quite read. "How many of you are here because you have to be?" she asked. About half the class raised their hands. I kept mine down, even though it was true. "How many of you have been told at some point that storytelling isn't a real skill?" More hands went up, including mine. She nodded slowly, like she'd expected this. "Good. Then you're exactly where you need to be." She walked to the board and wrote in large letters, "Your story matters." Then she turned back to us. "I don't care if you're pre-med or pre-law or pre-whatever your parents want you to be. I don't care if you think you're just here to check a box. For the next 15 weeks, you're going to learn that the ability to tell a story, to structure information, to create meaning, to connect with other humans through narrative, is one of the most valuable skills you can develop." Someone in the front row raised their hand. "But how does that help in the real world?" Professor Hartley smiled. "Everything is storytelling. Every pitch you'll ever make, every job interview, every time you need to persuade, inspire, or explain something complex to someone else. Doctors tell stories to patients. Lawyers tell stories to juries. Scientists tell stories about their research. The person who can tell the most compelling story wins." She paused, letting that sink in. "But more importantly, and this is what I really want you to understand, your personal stories matter. The experiences you've lived, the perspectives you bring, the voice that is uniquely yours. Those aren't distractions from your real education. They're the foundation of everything meaningful you'll ever create." I felt something crack open in my chest. This woman was giving me permission to care about the thing I'd been told not to care about, and I was terrified of how much I wanted to believe her. The first assignment was deceptively simple. Write about a moment when you felt invisible, 500 to 1,000 words, due next week. I stared at that prompt for 3 days. Not because I didn't have material. I had too much material. There was the time in 8th grade when I won a writing award, and my parents didn't come to the ceremony because my father had an extra shift. The time I stayed up all night finishing a short story for English class, and my mother threw it away because she needed the notebook for grocery lists. The countless dinner conversations where my parents discussed my future as if I weren't sitting right there. But writing about any of that felt like betrayal. Like airing dirty laundry. Like being ungrateful for everything they'd sacrificed. So I wrote something safe. A generic story about feeling overlooked in a crowded cafeteria. It was fine, competent, forgettable. I turned it in and tried not to think about the much better, much more honest version sitting in my deleted files. A week later, I found a note paper-clipped to my returned assignment. "Please, come to office hours. We need to talk. Professor Hartley." My stomach dropped. In my experience, "we need to talk" never meant anything good. I showed up to her office the next afternoon, prepared to defend my work, or accept a bad grade, or whatever punishment was coming. Professor Hartley's office was exactly what you'd expect. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk buried under papers, and a coffee maker that looked like it predated the internet. She gestured for me to sit. "Your writing is technically proficient," she said without preamble. "Good grammar, clean structure, perfectly adequate." I waited for the but. "But it's a lie." I blinked. I don't understand." She leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. "You're a good enough writer that I can tell when you're holding back. This assignment, it's not bad. It's just not true. Not emotionally true. You gave me a performance. I want the real thing." My face burned. I wrote what the assignment asked for. "No, you wrote what you thought I wanted to hear. There's a difference." She pulled out a file folder and opened it. Inside was the enrollment information I'd filled out on the first day of class. "Biology major," she read aloud. "Pre-med track. Why are you in this class? General education requirement. Try again." The question hung in the air. I could feel my carefully constructed walls starting to crumble. "I used to write," I said quietly, "when I was younger. But it's not practical." "Practical for whom?" For anyone. For a career. For... I stopped. Realizing I was about to say, for my parents. Professor Hartley nodded slowly, like I'd just confirmed something she'd suspected. Can I tell you something I've learned in 40 years of teaching? I nodded. The students who tell me they're being practical are usually the ones running from something that scares them. And 9 times out of 10, what scares them isn't failure. It's success. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that she didn't understand my situation. But something in her eyes, something knowing and sad, made me pause. I want you to rewrite this assignment, she said. And this time, I want you to be brave. Write about a moment when you felt invisible, but write the truth. The uncomfortable, scary, real truth. Can you do that? I left her office with the assignment sheet clutched in my hand, my carefully organized life suddenly feeling very fragile. That night, I opened my laptop and stared at the blinking cursor for an hour. Then I started typing, not the safe version, the real one. I wrote about being 16 years old, sitting at the dinner table while my parents discussed my future in my second language, the one they knew I struggled with, because they didn't want my opinion. They wanted compliance. I wrote about the specific moment when I realized they saw me as a project, not a person. I wrote about the shame of wanting things they didn't understand and the guilt of feeling ungrateful. I wrote about the slow, suffocating experience of making yourself smaller and smaller to fit into someone else's vision of who you should be. When I finished, it was 3 a.m. I read it over once, felt sick to my stomach, and almost deleted the whole thing. Instead, I saved it, closed my laptop, and lay awake until dawn. The next day, I turned it in before I could change my mind. When I got the assignment back a week later, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely open the folder. There were notes in the margins, lots of them. My first thought was that I'd made a terrible mistake, that I'd overshared, been too personal, crossed some invisible line. Then I started actually reading the comments. Next to the paragraph about my parents speaking in their first language. This image is devastating. You've captured the isolation perfectly. Next to the description of making myself smaller. This metaphor does exactly what good writing should do. It makes the internal external. At the bottom of the page, and in Professor Hartley's distinctive handwriting, this is real writing. This is what I was looking for. You have a gift, not just for constructing sentences, but for articulating complex emotional experiences in ways that create connection. Don't waste it. Don't you dare waste it. My grade, A+. But it wasn't the grade that made me cry in the hallway outside the classroom. It was the feeling of being seen, really seen, maybe for the first time in my life. If you've ever had someone believe in you when no one else did, drop a comment. Let's celebrate those people who saw our potential before we could see it ourselves. And hit that subscribe button. This story is just getting started. After that assignment, something shifted. I started showing up to class early, participating in discussions, actually doing the reading instead of skimming. So, for the first time since starting university, I felt awake. The contrast between my storytelling class and my biology lectures became increasingly stark. In bio, I was going through the motions. In storytelling, I was actually learning, growing, discovering things about myself and the world. But this created a new problem. The more I engaged with writing, the harder it became to pretend I was okay with my pre-med track. I'd sit in chemistry lab, pipetting solutions, and mentally compose story openings. I'd study for anatomy exams and daydream about narrative structure. And at night, Instead of reviewing biology flashcards, I'd write pages and pages of stories that no one would ever read. My biology grades started slipping. Nothing dramatic. I went from A's to B's, but enough that my parents noticed. What's going on?" my mother asked during one of our weekly phone calls. "Are the classes too hard? Do you need a tutor?" "No, I'm fine. Just adjusting." "You need to stay focused. Medical school is competitive. You can't afford to let your GPA drop." I wanted to tell her the truth, that my GPA was dropping because I was spending 4 hours a night writing stories that made me feel more alive than I'd felt in years. But I knew what she'd say. So I just agreed to refocus and hung up, feeling like a fraud. Midway through the semester, Professor Hartley announced our major project. "You're going to write a personal essay, 3,000 words, about a defining moment in your life. The moment when you realized something crucial about yourself or the world. This isn't fiction. This is creative nonfiction. I want truth shaped by craft." She paused, looking around the room. "And here's the twist. You're going to read it out loud, to the class, in 3 weeks. The room erupted in nervous chatter. Public speaking wasn't my strong suit. Reading my own deeply personal writing to 30 strangers? That was nightmare territory. But I also felt this strange excitement. I knew exactly what I wanted to write about. I spent the next 3 weeks writing the most honest thing I'd ever created. It was about the moment I stopped believing I could be a writer. The summer between junior and senior year of high school, when I'd won a national essay competition. The prize was a full scholarship to a prestigious creative writing summer program. I was ecstatic. This was validation. This was proof that maybe, just maybe, I could actually do this. I brought the acceptance letter to my parents with trembling hands. My father was watching TV. My mother was folding laundry. "I won something," I said. "That's nice, honey," my mother replied without looking up. "It's a scholarship to a writing program at a really good university." My father muted the TV. "When is it?" "July, 6 weeks." "You're working at the restaurant in July?" "I know, but this is—" "You already committed to the job. You can't just quit." I tried to explain. The prestige of the program, the opportunity to work with published authors, the fact that it was free. My mother finally looked at me. "Sweetheart, that's very nice, but you need to be practical. You need job experience. This writing thing, it's a hobby. You can write anytime. You can't get a job reference anytime." "But this could help me get into better colleges. It's competitive. People would—" "People would what?" my father interrupted. "Be impressed? Give you a job writing stories? That's not how the world works. You need real skills." I stood there, acceptance letter crumpling in my hand, and felt something die inside me. I turned down the scholarship. I spent that summer making minimum wage serving tourists and pretended it was fine. The day of the essay readings arrived. I'd practiced reading mine out loud a dozen times in my dorm room. Each time, I ended up crying by the conclusion. Not great for public speaking, but I was determined to get through it. Several students went before me. Their essays were good. Stories about family members they'd lost, moments of cultural awakening, early experiences with discrimination or identity. Each reading made me more nervous and more certain that my story mattered. When it was my turn, I walked to the front of the room with my printed essay and a bottle of water for my inevitable dry mouth. "This is called The Summer I Chose Fear," I said, and then I started reading. I made it through the setup, the competition win, the excitement, bringing the letter home, without incident. But when I got to the conversation with my parents, my voice cracked. "You need real skills," I read, mimicking my father's dismissive tone. I looked up from the page and saw students leaning forward, completely engaged. Professor Hartley was in the back of the room, arms crossed, eyes intense. I kept reading. When I reached the conclusion, the paragraph about how I'd spent years confusing obedience with love and practicality with safety, I saw several students wiping their eyes. I finished the last line. I chose fear that summer, but I'm choosing differently now. The classroom was silent for a long moment. Then someone started clapping. Then another person. Then everyone. I looked at Professor Hartley. She was nodding slowly, this expression of fierce pride on her face. I'd never felt more vulnerable or more powerful in my life. After class, 3 different students came up to me. "That was incredible," one said. "I've never heard anyone articulate that feeling so perfectly." "Your parents sound like mine," another added. "Everything you said about choosing their version of safety over your own dreams." I felt that. Even some of the pre-med students, the ones I'd assumed were just checking a box, told me they related. I left the classroom feeling like I was floating. That night, I got an email from Professor Hartley. "I don't say this lightly. You're one of the most naturally talented writers I've taught in 4 decades. Your voice is distinctive, your insights are valuable, and your technical skills are already far beyond most undergraduate students. I suspect you're at a crossroads. I won't presume to tell you what to do with your life. That's not my place. But I will tell you this. Talent without courage is just tragedy. And you're too brave to let fear win. Think about what you really want. And then think about what you're willing to risk to get it. My office hours are Tuesdays and Thursdays, if you want to talk." I read that email 20 times. Then I cried. Then I opened my pre-med course schedule for next semester, and I stared at it until 3 a.m., trying to figure out who I was more afraid of disappointing, my parents or myself. Thanksgiving break was coming up. I'd be going home for 5 days, seeing my parents, probably being asked about my grades and my classes and my future plans. I had 2 options. Option 1, stay the course, keep lying, keep pretending. Graduate with a biology degree, apply to medical schools I didn't want to attend, and become someone I wasn't. Option 2, tell the truth, change my major, pursue writing, disappoint the 2 people who'd sacrificed everything for me. When you frame it like that, the choice seems obvious, right? Choose yourself, follow your dreams, all those inspirational poster cliches. But real life is messier than that. Because my parents' sacrifices weren't abstract. They were concrete. My father's destroyed back from years of factory work. My mother's hands, permanently scarred from cleaning chemicals. The tiny apartment they still lived in because they'd been saving for my education. How do you look those sacrifices in the face and say, "Thanks, but I'm going to do something you think is worthless"? I scheduled an appointment with Professor Hartley. "I don't know what to do," I told her, sitting in that book-filled office for what felt like the 100th time. Professor Hartley poured me coffee from her ancient coffee maker, set the mug in front of me, sat down with her own. "Tell me what you're afraid of," she said. "Disappointing my parents, proving them right, wasting their sacrifices. Anything else?" I hesitated. "Being wrong? What if I change majors and I'm not actually good enough? What if this is just delusion?" She sipped her coffee. "Can I tell you about my father?" I nodded. "He was a coal miner, 6th grade education, worked underground for 40 years until his lungs gave out. When I told him I wanted to study literature, he said, and I quote, 'Books are for rich people and fools.' What did you do?" "I studied literature anyway, got my PhD, became a professor. He died thinking I'd wasted my life. She said it matter-of-factly, but I could hear the old pain underneath. Do you regret it? I asked. Every day, and never. She leaned forward. Here's what I learned. You can't live someone else's dreams without killing your own. And you can't make someone else's sacrifices meaningful by sacrificing yourself. But what if they're right? What if this is impractical and foolish and... Then you'll learn. You'll adapt. You'll figure it out. But you'll do it as yourself, not as some version of you that makes other people comfortable. She picked up a pen and piece of paper, drew a line down the middle. Let's do an exercise. On the left side, write down what happens if you stay on your current path. On the right, write what happens if you change. I stared at the paper. Be brutally honest, she said. Not what you think should happen, what will actually happen. I started writing, parents are happy, for now. Safe career path, constant resentment. Spend my life helping people in a field I'm not passionate about. Wonder what if, forever. Possibly burn out. Possibly grow to resent my parents. Die having never tried, parents are disappointed. Definitely. Uncertain career path, temporary conflict with family. Spend my life doing something I'm passionate about. Possibly fail, but at least I tried. Have to figure out how to make it financially viable. Die having been myself. Looking at it written out made something crystallize. The question isn't whether your parents will be disappointed, Professor Hartley said softly. They might be, probably will be at first. The question is, can you live with disappointing them? Or will disappointing yourself destroy you faster? I knew the answer. I'd been disappointing myself for years. It was killing me slowly. Maybe disappointing my parents would hurt, but it wouldn't be fatal. Thanksgiving dinner was exactly as uncomfortable as I'd expected. My mother had made all my favorite foods, her way of showing love when words failed. My father asked about my classes. I gave vague answers. Your biology professor mentioned you missed a study session, he said, because of course my parents had somehow gotten the professor's email. I had a conflict with another class. What class? Here it was, the moment. I could deflect, change the subject, maintain the peace for one more holiday, or I could be brave. A writing class, narrative structure. My mother's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Writing, still? I thought you were focusing on your science courses. I am, but this is a required class, general education. She said, the sound loaded with unspoken judgment. We ate in silence for several minutes. Then my father asked the question I'd been dreading. Have you thought more about which medical schools you'll apply to? You need to start preparing for the MCAT soon. My hands were shaking. I set down my fork. I need to tell you something. They both looked at me with this identical expression of concern mixed with suspicion. I don't want to go to medical school. The silence was deafening. What do you mean you don't want to go? My mother asked carefully. This is what we've been planning for years. You've been planning. I've been going along with it because I didn't want to disappoint you. My father's expression hardened. So, you've wasted 2 years of education? 2 years of our money? No, I've been learning. I've been figuring out who I am and what I actually want. And what is that? My mother asked, her voice rising. To be a writer? To struggle and starve and fail? Maybe, or maybe to succeed, but either way, to try. My father pushed his plate away. This is that professor, isn't she? Filling your head with nonsense. No, she's helping me see clearly for the first time in my life. See what? That you're smarter than your parents? That our sacrifices weren't good enough? That your sacrifices shouldn't require me to sacrifice myself. The words came out sharper than I intended. My mother's eyes filled with tears. Everything we've done, every choice we've made, it was for you, to give you security, stability, a better life than we had. I know, and I'm grateful. But a better life than you had doesn't mean the life you would have chosen for me. It means a life where I get to choose. My father stood up from the table. I won't support this. If you change your major to something useless, you're on your own. I'm not asking you to support it. I'm asking you to accept that I'm an adult making my own choices. Stupid choices. Maybe, but mine. He left the kitchen. A moment later, I heard the TV turn on in the living room, his standard conflict avoidance tactic. My mother stayed at the table, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "You don't know what it's like to have nothing, to work 3 jobs just to keep a roof over your head, to watch your child have opportunities you could never dream of, and then watch them throw it all away." I moved to sit next to her. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing differently." "You're choosing to struggle." "Maybe, or maybe I'm choosing to be happy. Isn't that what you wanted for me?" To be happy? We wanted you to be secure." "Those aren't the same thing." She wiped her eyes. "What if you fail? What if you end up like us, working jobs you hate just to survive?" "Then I'll survive. You did. You taught me how." She laughed bitterly. "That's not a compliment." "Yes, it is. You showed me how to be resilient, how to work hard, how to sacrifice for what matters. I'm using those lessons, just not the way you expected." We sat in silence. The TV droned in the other room. The kitchen clock ticked. Finally, my mother spoke. "I can't support this. I can't watch you make this mistake and pretend I think it's okay." "I'm not asking you to pretend. I'm asking you to trust that I know myself." "You're 23 years old. You don't know anything." "Then let me learn." She shook her head and stood up, began clearing the table. The conversation was over. I went back to campus the next day, a day earlier than planned. My father didn't say goodbye. My mother hugged me stiffly and said, "Call when you come to your senses." I cried the entire 3-hour bus ride back to school. The Monday after Thanksgiving, I changed my major. Biology to English, with a concentration in creative writing. It took 15 minutes to fill out the paperwork. 15 minutes to undo 2 years of pretending. My academic advisor looked concerned. "Are you sure about this? Your science GPA is solid. You could still get into good medical programs." "I'm sure." "This will mean taking extra courses to meet the new requirements. You might need a 5th year." "I know." "And career prospects in creative writing are uncertain." "I know that too." She sighed and signed the form. "Well, good luck." I emailed Professor Hartley to tell her. She replied within an hour. "Proud of you. Come by office hours this week." That night, I called my parents to make it official. My mother answered. "Have you changed your mind?" "No, I changed my major." Silence. Then, "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." "Don't call back until you're ready to apologize and fix this." She hung up. I sat on my dorm room floor and cried until I couldn't breathe. But underneath the grief and guilt and fear, there was something else. Relief. The next few months were brutal. My parents kept their word. They didn't call, didn't respond to my messages, didn't send money for anything beyond the tuition they'd already committed to. I got a work-study job in the library. Picked up weekend shifts at a coffee shop, survived on ramen and guilt, but I also thrived. My writing courses were everything I'd hoped for. I worked with professors who understood craft, studied authors who'd turned lived experience into art, workshopped stories with peers who got it. I joined the university literary magazine, started submitting work to small journals, got rejected? A lot, but occasionally, gloriously, got accepted. The first time I saw my name in print, a 2,000-word personal essay in a tiny online magazine that paid in contributor copies, I sobbed with joy. I sent the link to my parents' email. They didn't respond. Spring semester of my senior year, Professor Hartley forwarded me an email. National Young Writers Fellowship, $10,000 prize, plus publication in a major literary journal, plus mentorship from established authors. I think you should apply. The fellowship was prestigious, competitive, out of my league, but I applied anyway. The submission required a portfolio, 3 original pieces showcasing range. I sent the essay about turning down the summer program, a short story about an immigrant family's kitchen table conversations, a piece about the difference between the language you speak at home and the language you speak everywhere else. I hit submit at 11:58 p.m. on the deadline day and immediately regretted all my choices. For 2 months, I checked my email obsessively. Every morning, every break between classes, every night before bed, nothing. I told myself it was fine. I hadn't expected to win anyway. This was just practice. Just one of many submissions I'd make in my career. But secretly, privately, I wanted it desperately. Not just the money, though that would change everything. Not just the publication, though that would be validating. I wanted proof. Concrete, undeniable proof that I'd made the right choice, that my parents were wrong about me, that Professor Hartley was right. The email came on a Wednesday in March. I was in the library, shelving books during my work-study shift, when my phone buzzed. Thank you for your submission to the National Young Writers Fellowship. My hands started shaking before I even read the rest. We received over 2,000 applications for 10 fellowships. The competition was exceptionally strong. I knew what was coming. Unfortunately, your work was not selected. I stood there in the stacks, surrounded by books, holding this rejection letter, and felt everything collapse. What had I done? I'd destroyed my relationship with my parents, derailed my safe career path, committed to a field with no guarantees. And for what? To be told I wasn't good enough anyway? Maybe they'd been right all along. I left work early, went back to my dorm room, and lay on my bed staring at the ceiling until my roommate came home and asked if I was okay. I'm fine, I lied. That night, I drafted an email to my parents. An apology. A white flag. I didn't send it, but I didn't delete it either. 2 days later, Professor Hartley's assistant emailed me. Professor Hartley needs to see you in her office, today if possible. My stomach sank. Was I failing a class? Had I done something wrong? I showed up at her office at 3 p.m., preparing for bad news. She opened the door with this expression I couldn't read. Not quite smiling, but something close. Sit down, she said. I sat, bracing myself. I heard about the fellowship, she said. I'm sorry you didn't get it. It's fine. I didn't really expect... Stop. She held up a hand. Don't do that thing where you pretend you didn't want it. You wanted it. You deserved it. The judges were idiots. Despite everything, I smiled. But, she continued, I want to show you something. She pulled out a folder and opened it. Inside were several pieces of paper, printed emails. After I nominated you for that fellowship, I also reached out to some colleagues. Other professors, editors I've worked with over the years. I sent them your portfolio, with your permission, which I probably should have asked for first, but I was in protective mentor mode. She slid the papers across the desk. They were responses. from editors at 3 different literary magazines, all saying the same thing. "Who is this writer? We'd like to publish this work." I stared at the papers, not quite believing what I was seeing. "You have publication offers," Professor Hartley said. "Real ones. From respected journals, including, and this is the big one." She pulled out one more email. "The editor of Contemporary Voices, one of the most prestigious literary journals in the country, wants to feature your kitchen table piece. They're calling it exactly the kind of fresh, necessary voice we need more of." I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. "That fellowship?" Professor Hartley continued. "Forget it. This is better. This is your work speaking for itself, finding its audience, making its way in the world on merit." She leaned back in her chair. "You didn't need judges to validate you. You needed your work to find the right readers, and it did. Over the next 6 months, my 3 essays were published. Each one generated responses, from readers, from other writers, from people who said, 'This is exactly how I feel, but I've never had the words for it.' One essay got picked up by a popular online platform and went viral. 15,000 shares, hundreds of comments. Many of them from other first-generation students saying, 'My parents don't understand either.' Some from parents saying, 'This helped me see my child's perspective.' This one made me cry, from a mother who wrote, 'I pushed my daughter toward medicine. She's now a miserable doctor. I wish I'd read this 15 years ago.' Professor Hartley framed my first publication and hung it in her office, seen next to similar frames from former students who'd gone on to careers as authors, journalists, professors. "You're in good company," she told me. I graduated with honors. The English department gave me an award for Most Promising Young Writer. I walked across the stage, accepted my diploma, and looked out at the audience. Professor Hartley was there, cheering. My roommate and her family were there, filming. My parents were not there. It hurt. I won't lie and say it didn't. But it also felt right, like I was graduating into myself, fully, finally, without apology. The 3 years after graduation were a blur of coffee shop jobs, freelance writing gigs, and late nights working on a book. I moved to a city where I knew no one, lived in a terrible apartment with 3 roommates, and made ends meet the way creative people always do, through hustle, stubbornness, and an alarming amount of pasta. But I was writing. Really writing. Every day. I built a portfolio, got an agent, sold a book, a memoir about first-generation identity and the cost of choosing yourself. It wasn't a bestseller, didn't make me rich, but it was mine, my story, my voice, and people read it, connected with it, saw themselves in it. One review called it a necessary exploration of immigrant family dynamics and the courage it takes to define success on your own terms. I kept that review in my wallet. 2 years after my book was published, I got a package at my apartment. No return address. Just my name and address in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a hardcover copy of my book and a letter. I opened it with shaking hands. "Dear daughter, I bought your book 6 months ago. I've been carrying it in my purse, trying to find the courage to read it. I finally did. Last week, in one sitting, I cried through most of it. Not because you made us sound like villains. You didn't. You were fair. Maybe too fair. But because I finally understood what you were trying to tell us that Thanksgiving. What you'd been trying to tell us your whole life. You were never rejecting our sacrifices. You were honoring them by choosing to sacrifice for something different, something yours. I'm sorry I didn't see that sooner. Your father is getting there. It's harder for him. His pride was hurt, but he finished reading your book last night, and this morning at breakfast, he said, 'She's a good writer.' Coming from him, that's a lot. I don't know if you want to hear from us. I understand if you don't. But I wanted you to know we're proud of you. I'm proud of you. Not because you proved us wrong, though you did, but because you were brave enough to prove yourself right. Love, Mom. I read the letter 3 times. Then I called her. She answered on the second ring, her voice tentative. Hello? Hi, Mom. A sharp intake of breath. You got my letter? I did. Silence. Then, I meant every word. I know. More silence. The comfortable kind this time. Will you come home for Thanksgiving? She asked. No pressure, but your father has been practicing saying I was wrong in the mirror. It's very entertaining. I laughed, cried, laughed again. Yeah, I'll come home. That Thanksgiving was nothing like the last one I'd spent at home. My father was stiff and awkward, but he asked about my writing. Actually asked. Listened to the answers. My mother had framed one of my published essays and hung it in the hallway, next to my high school diploma and their citizenship certificates. I show everyone who comes over, she admitted. I brag about you constantly. Really? Really. I tell them my daughter is a published author, that she writes about real things, important things. We didn't talk about the lost years, the silence, the hurt feelings. Maybe we would eventually, maybe we wouldn't. But sitting at that kitchen table, eating my mother's cooking, watching my parents try, really try, to understand the choice I'd made, it was enough. I'm 31 now. I teach creative writing at a community college. Ironically, the same job Professor Hartley had when she was my age. I'm working on my second book, still freelancing, still hustling. But I wake up every morning excited about what I get to do that day. Is my life stable? Not by my parents' definition. Am I rich? Definitely not. But am I enough? Yeah, I really am. A few months ago, one of my students, a first-generation college student whose parents want her to be an accountant, came to my office hours and said, I don't think I can do this. I don't think I'm cut out to be a writer. And I heard Professor Hartley's voice in my head. The students who tell me they're being practical are usually the ones running from something that scares them. I looked at this terrified, talented student and said, write me something true, something that scares you, and then we'll talk about whether you're cut out for this. She came back a week later with the best piece of writing she'd done all semester. Last week, she told me she's changing her major to creative writing. Her parents aren't happy, but she is. And someday, hopefully, they will be too. Because here's what I learned. You can't live someone else's dream without killing your own. And the people who love you, really love you, will eventually understand that. Maybe not immediately, maybe not easily, but eventually. My parents said I'd never be enough. Professor Hartley disagreed, and in the end, I learned that the only person whose opinion really mattered was mine. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt caught between who you are and who you're supposed to be, drop a comment below. Share your story. Let's create a space where choosing yourself doesn't feel so lonely. And if you want more stories about finding your path even when no one understands it, subscribe and hit that notification bell, because your story matters, your voice matters, you matter. Thanks for listening.